Okay, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Today we're talking about Samuel Sewall. He was a contemporary of Cotton Mather, who I talked about last week. And speaking of which, what did I leave out from Cotton Mather? So last week, I had the problem of not really having a lot to say about William Penn that I had forgotten from the week before. This time I have a surplus of things about Cotton Mather that I had left, that I really wanted to say, but just left out. So Cotton Mather, the great Puritan pastor, minister, as I said, had 15 children, 9 from his first wife, 6 from his second. He outlived all but 2. Most of them died in infancy or as toddlers. And of course it was painful every time a child dies. But the one that was probably the most painful for him was his son that he named after his father, Increase. And his nickname for his darling son was Creasy. He had very attached to him. And his son grew up, unfortunately, to be an alcoholic and something of a libertine. He would get into bar fights and was arrested. There was at one point a prostitute who came forward and said that she had a son by him. And this was very difficult for the great minister of Boston, Cotton Mather, to confront his son. Why can you not serve God in the way you should? You need to repent of these sins. Over and over again, he talks about in his diary, praying with his son, Creasy, to get him away from the bad influences that he was always drawn to, the debts that he was always getting himself into. And finally, at the age of 25, his son, who was still going through rough times, trying to get his act together, he took sail for England. He wanted to start anew in England. He had been there before, and he liked it. Of course, he got himself in trouble there, as he did everywhere. But he wanted to go back to England, and a short time after, a few weeks after he left, Cotton Mather got the news that the ship had been lost at sea, and his son, with everybody else, had died. And he goes on in his diary how awful, how sad he was, that he bemoans his poor lost son at sea, hoping that between the times that he had seen him, that at some point he actually had put his faith in God and was saved and was not destined to perdition, which was a great concern of his. His son left a note before he left that he promised his father that he was going to get his life together and that he was going to serve God. So Cotton Mather had some hope that his son had actually become a true Christian at that point. But it was a very sad thing to read in Cotton Mather's diary, his poor son that he loved so well. Everybody loved him, as a matter of fact. He was a great guy to be around, very cheerful, pleasant sort of fellow, but just could not get away from the alcohol and the bad company. So another thing I wanted to talk about with Cotton Mather. In his later years, still publishing, he knew a young man who worked for a publishing house And this young man would come and pick up the manuscripts and go publish them at his house, at his place of business. This young man was Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin wrote about Cotton Mather in his autobiography. He loved Cotton Mather. He thought he was a great guy. And there was a little incident that he talks about where he's visiting Cotton Mather there to pick up a manuscript. And he's walking out the house, out of the house, and they're going downstairs. And Benjamin Franklin is in the lead, and he turns around talking to Cotton Mather. And Cotton Mather says, "Stoop, stoop." And Benjamin Franklin, young man, doesn't know what he's talking about. What do you mean, stoop? And then he bonks his head on a beam across the hallway. And then Cotton Mather always has a lesson for that. As you go through life, young man, remember to stoop. Many a proud fellow has met his doom because they do not go through life humbly. And Benjamin Franklin remembered that throughout his life. And one other thing. So Benjamin Franklin, a great fan of Cotton Mather, there was a particular essay that was most famous, one of the most famous essays that Cotton Mather wrote, Essays to Do Good. And a young Benjamin Franklin remembered in his old age that he had read this article, this essay, and found it to do, it greatly influenced him, because Benjamin Franklin also was a guy who enjoyed doing good to others. So, as I say, it's a famous essay, and you will actually find it in anthologies of English literature. My first introduction to Cotton Mather and Samuel Sewall was not in a history course. It was in an English course where I had this anthology, and the first several writings in this anthology are Puritan writers. Their diaries, their essays, things like that. So I read this article, I read this essay by Cotton Mather, and I wish I could say that I enjoyed it like Benjamin Franklin did, but I don't. I didn't. How do you write an essay, several pages long, Essays to Do Good, entitled, and not have one example of doing good? It's all theory. Doing good is a great thing because it glorifies God. That's fine. Doing good is a great thing because it helps your fellow man. That's wonderful. Give me an example. And there's no examples. So, anyway. So I've gone on long enough about Cotton Mather, and I'm talking about Samuel Sewall. So, I really like this painting of Samuel Sewall. It's very well done, I think. And it also shows one of his core beliefs that you might not notice at first. One of the things that he really spoke out against in his life that was kind of a losing battle. Anybody guess?
Wigs.
He was not wearing a wig. The style of the day was to wear a periwig, those big, atrocious looking things that seemed so fashionable at the time. He refused, and he was appalled that men would wear such gaudy things. Men with perfectly nice heads of hair would shave off their hair and wear the periwig because it was the fashion of the day. So, my bibliography, I have three very nice biographies of Samuel Sewall. This first one, Ola Elizabeth Winslow. She's a very nice biographer back in the 50s and 60s. I have 3 different biographies by her. The thing I enjoy about her is that she writes, in some instances, kind of like a novelist. She's a very good biographer, well-researched works, but it comes off, to me, something like a novel. And in some instances, I really like that, because it's very readable. In other instances, not so much, but all in all, I enjoyed her writings. The next one, Richard Francis, Judge Sewall's Apology. This is 412 pages. This would be the one that I would say is the most well-researched, the most thorough of the bunch. Maybe even more thorough than one might like. But it's well-written, not difficult to get through, and thoroughly enjoyable. There's so much there in his life, because he wrote his diary as well. So yeah, it's very nicely done. The last one, Eve LaPlante, the Salem Witch Judge, The Life and Repentance of Samuel Sewall. This one is probably the most personal of the group, because Eve LaPlante claims that she is a descendant of Samuel Sewall, and she has stories from her family history, stories that have brought down, and she inserts into this biography. Now, some of you may know my feelings on oral history, and how I see that as very unhistorical in a lot of instances. However, she makes it personal in many different ways, and it's very readable because that. She treats Samuel Sewall as her family, as, she's a descendant. She puts in the details that come from her oral history, from her family, are not significant enough to detract from her scholarship. So let me just say that. It's still a very good biography. And as I say, she has a very personal touch to it. So it's enjoyable for that. And then, of course, I have the Diary of Samuel Sewall. I have an abridged version. The full length is somewhat over 1,200 pages, so the abridgment is good enough for me. Okay. Born March 28th, 1652, to Henry and Jane Sewall in England. His father was a fairly prosperous merchant who traveled back and forth between America and England, and finally decided to go in 1661 to Boston and settle there permanently. Samuel was 9 at the time. He got his bachelor's degree from Harvard, and then his master's degree, and was married happily to Hannah Hull, February of 1676. He received a dowry of 500 pounds, which was paid to him in shillings, 10,000 shillings, which would weigh about 125 pounds, possibly the weight of his bride. For those of you who are fans of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was very much involved because he was a descendant of one of the Salem Witch judges, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote quite a bit about the early Puritans. And he has a story in the whole history of Grandfather's Chair, where Hannah was weighed against a bunch of shillings. And that's how they determined what the dowry would be. Of course, it's just Nathaniel Hawthorne who says this. It's not actual. But it's interesting that the weight of those shillings could have been about her weight. Now, we know that it didn't happen that way because Samuel Sewall talks about this in his diary, that he was paid in installments. It was not a lump sum. So he moved into his father-in-law's house and lived very nicely there. He worked with his father, who was a merchant, or his father-in-law, who was a merchant, and the mint master. One of the reasons that his father-in-law could pay this dowry in shillings was that he was the mint master who minted the coins, and he was paid in coins that he was making himself. So Samuel became a freeman in 1678, and then a constable. Then he was appointed as the colony's publisher in 1681. His father-in-law died, and so Samuel took over the merchant business and did pretty well for himself. His career, however, the many various offices that he held throughout his life, he was more a politician and a judge than he was a merchant. In 1688, he went with Increase Mather to England. The Massachusetts charter had been pulled, had been confiscated, had been taken by the crown. And Increase Mather went to England to argue his case that Massachusetts should have their charter back. He was not successful in that, but the negotiations helped Massachusetts nonetheless in the charter that was eventually given to them by the crown. But anyway, Samuel went with Increase as a help. Increase didn't really care for that help much, and so he became a tourist, and he loved it. He enjoyed touring the countryside, seeing the various castles and cathedrals. He witnessed the arrival of Queen Mary being rowed up the Thames to Whitehall, and wrote about that in his diary. Took a grand tour of England and seeing all kinds of the wonderful touristy things that Americans now do in our own day. And he loved music. One thing that Puritans were very much against, and that was musical accompaniment. In the churches, you have a cappella only, for if you are a Puritan church. No instruments allowed. And so when he visited England, he thought it was wonderful to hear the organs and the various other instruments. He absolutely loved music. So he visited Whitehall, St. Paul's, and I'm sure many of you have seen these as well. And then we come to the dark side of Puritan history, and that was the witch craze. He was chosen, since he was a magistrate, as one of the 9 judges on the court of Oyer and Terminer. I had to look that one up. What in the world does Oyer and Terminer mean? Well, it's to hear and determine. And so that's the literal translation. And it's basically, this is a special court. And this would happen every so often in special cases. You get together these judges to hear and determine the seriousness of these crimes. Unfortunately, as extensive as his diaries are and all of the things that he wrote about, he wrote very little about the witch craze and the time that he was the judge on these cases. So we don't know a lot about his feelings at the time. It coincides, I think, with a lot of other people who did not want to write about this as well, or maybe destroyed what they had written about it afterwards because of the shame of it all. Anyway, some notes that we do have on the hanging of one group of people who were pleading their innocence. One man who had been a pastor of a church and had been retired for some time stood up, and before he was hung, he said the Lord's Prayer with no trouble at all. And that's not something that a witch was supposed to be able to do. And so they were kind of overawed. The people of the crowd really started thinking this was all wrong and wanted them to not be hung. And so his comment, Samuel Sewall's comment, was that these are unthinking people who were moved by a speech. They did deserve to be hung, in his opinion, at that time. Here's the witches on trial. This was the same case in which Cotton Mather, as I mentioned last week, gave a speech to the crowd saying that these were witches who deserved to die because they had served the devil. So something that many people noticed after the witch craze had finally died down, they put away the court of Oyer and Terminer, canceled the rest of the trials, and let everybody go. Bad things started happening in Massachusetts, Boston, Salem. Obviously, this was God's judgment. There was a terrible harvest, 1696, coldest winter on record. A great shortage of food at that time, the following year. The Indians were attacking in the north. Many were killed. 2 Harvard students drowned while ice skating. Hailstorm destroyed part of Sewall's house. Hannah delivered a stillborn child, and his 2-year-old darling daughter died of some fever with convulsions. And Samuel Sewall, along with many other people, knew in their heart that God was punishing them for the witch craze and the people who were executed. And so, January 14th, 1697, the magistrates voted on this. We need to have a day of fasting and prayer, of humiliation, confessing our sins to God. We need forgiveness. And Samuel Sewall, alone among the judges, said he was going to apologize or submit his apology in church and be very public about it. So he handed a note to his pastor, and this was on a Thursday, not on a Sunday. Thursday was the meeting time for kind of the midweek service. And he handed, as his pastor walked up the aisle, he handed this apology to his pastor, who would read it to the parishioners. He is, and so this is the pastor speaking, he is upon many accounts more concerned than any that he knows of, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men. So here's Sewall pastor reading his apology, standing up with his head bowed to show everybody that he is taking the blame for this atrocity that was committed to 20 people who were executed and more than 150 who had been in prison for some time on accusations of witchcraft. He was not, however, the only one to apologize. Samuel Parris, the pastor in Salem, in whose house this whole thing started, the girls who were making accusations were his niece and daughter and friends who started this whole mess. And Samuel Parris did not handle it well, and everybody knew it. He was not a very popular pastor in his church, and he was all but forced to give this apology because they were wanting to get rid of him. And so 2 years before Samuel Sewall made his apology, Samuel Parris makes this declaration that God has been righteously spitting in my face. What a thing to say, huh? Also, there were some of the jurors on the witch trial cases. Thomas Fisk, along with others, signed this paper that said, "We do therefore hereby signify to all in general our deep sense of and sorrow for our errors." And finally, Ann Putnam, one of the main young girls who at the age of 13 was accusing all kinds of people, virtually anyone that she came across. She could, at whim, accuse and have them arrested. So in 1706, she's 27 now, and issues her apology. "I do desire to lie in the dust and be humbled for it, that I was a cause of so sad a calamity." So at this point, everybody recognizes what a horrible tragedy and miscarriage of justice that witch craze was.
Question.
Yes?
These evidences of God's wrath, did they come after people changed their minds or before?
So it was not long after the witch craze had died down. So the witch craze was in 1692, the summer of 1692. By the fall, it was done. The following year, 1693, that's when supposedly all these terrible things started happening.
You would have thought it more reasonable for God to get really pissed off while they were still committing these crimes rather than afterwards.
Yes. Well, if you read the diaries, and there's lots. One of the great things about Puritans, lots of them kept diaries, and some of them are very vivid in the day-to-day life. And Samuel Sewall's is one of the best. The day-to-day life of a person at that time. You'd think, how can you distinguish between this tragic year in which so many people died for one reason or another, and this other tragic year when, again, lots of people died for some, various and sundry reasons? It seemed like just, if you read Samuel Sewall's diary, almost every page has somebody dying a tragic death. Somebody that he hears of, a neighbor that he knows, his own children. It's a sad tale to read in some instances, and sometimes you hear about the Indians have attacked and killed 100 people in a village far up north. Just one thing after another. So one of the things that may have spurred it was the very poor harvest that affects everybody all together at one time. That's a really big deal. So, lots of tragedies virtually every year. But I think their sense of guilt after this this terrible witch craze was such that now they're thinking, now everything bad that's happening, it's because God is punishing us for that.
What caused this sense of guilt? What happened over the 6 months to change everybody's mind?
Well, just the sheer enormity of it. I mean, it was 20 people who had died. 19 of them were hung. One of them was pressed to death. And so many of them were well known to be good, decent people. But the witch craze at the time, the young girls were so convincing in their throwing themselves on the floor in agonies because so-and-so has been tormenting them. It just got a hold of so many people. And then once you get sober after that, you think, wow, this whole thing was just made up in the minds of these young girls. Yes?
It's pretty well known now that when you are in a panic or intense state of fear, your brain's ability to be reasonable shuts down.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see what life was like that summer of 1692, because so many people were on pins and needles thinking, am I going to be next? Are they going to accuse me? Yes?
The same thing happened in Europe. Was it about the same time?
So this was actually one of the last witch crazes. Europe had been having them for hundreds of years. There's actually one in Sweden, I think 30 or 40 years prior to this one. In Sweden, hundreds and hundreds of people were executed. This one is small potatoes compared to what went on in Europe. However, this was one of the last ones in the Western world to occur. So, anyway. So, Samuel Sewall was also a writer. He liked writing about various topics. He wrote poems, and this very interesting but very convoluted piece of literature, he wanted to let people know that in the new world, this is going to be the new Jerusalem. Christ will be coming soon, as we know. The Indians will soon be converted. Once that happens, the Jews, who are already starting to come to America, the Jews of the world will come to America, and the millennium will start. We can see it happening in our own time. So the book of Revelations, the vials of chapter 16, the 7 vials that are going to be poured out. 5 of them, as we know, have already been poured out. The Jews of Europe will come to America, joining their brethren, the Indians, because as we know, the Indians are the lost 10 tribes of Israel, right? That was well believed by many people at the time. And so the Indians will be converted because they're also Jews. The Jews of Europe will come to America, and we will have the millennium. Now, as nonsensical as that appears to us today, it was something that he was very proud of. He printed this himself and passed out copies to all of his friends so that everybody could see it. The odd thing about that is that today, or should I say, in the 1960s in America, this piece, phenomena, was seen as as a harbinger of the environmental movement. Now, how do you get that from something as crackpot as the millennium is about to happen, because all the Native Americans who are the lost 10 tribes of Israel are soon going to be converted, and Christ will return and start the 1,000-year millennium? Well, in his description of America, he has some very beautiful scenes describing the nature that exists in America, and very poetic about it as well. And so it's one fairly short passage of this 60-page work, but it's very inspirational. And so in the 1960s, this work got something of a revival, and people thought even the Puritans could appreciate nature. And so that was kind of a harbinger of the environmental movement. Sewall and slavery. Always a compassionate man, Samuel Sewall. Always feeling concern for those less fortunate than him, and especially with regard to slavery. He had always been troubled by the slave trade. And so he wrote this, The Selling of Joseph, from the Old Testament story of Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery. And this very telling quote, "It is most certain that all men, as they are sons of Adam, have equal right unto liberty." Very radical thing to say in the year 1700. This quite possibly could be the first anti-slavery tract written, maybe not in the world, but in America at least. There was no movement anywhere in the world to abolish slavery. This is something that Samuel Sewall, in his own heart, came up with, because there really weren't many people who would believe along those lines. And again, he published this himself, and he passed it out to all the friends and family, virtually just about anybody he encountered. He wanted this to be known. So here's slavery, and I had mentioned earlier that the slave trade in African slaves was still something that was not as prevalent as it would be. Most servants, they were household servants who would also work the fields, were white, indentured servants from England and other European countries. And some of them were just paid servants as a normal job. In 1700, most servants or slaves would not be black. They would be white at this point. After 1700, the slave trade picked up, and there were more and more African slaves coming to America, to the point where slavery became a black thing and not a white thing. And as I said, Samuel Sewall had great compassion for all that he saw, and so he actually fought for the rights of Indians, African American, and women. Now, the struggles that he fought for, he didn't stand out, and he wouldn't be ridiculed too much for these. He didn't go way out of his way, but he did bring it up, and he wrote about it in his diary. He wanted to reduce or eliminate the penalties for racial intermarriage, which could be punished by death if a white person married a black person. He wanted to eliminate or reduce that penalty, and marrying an Indian also would be punished as well. And he wanted to get rid of that punishment. He often fought or helped negotiate the marriage of one slave to another. If a slave from one master wanted to marry the slave of another master, that could be a problem. And so on a number of occasions, he would be the guy to negotiate this. So the one master would say, I don't want this to happen because I don't want my servant being distracted from his or her work. And so the negotiations, how often can you give up your servant in order to see their spouse? And what about children? And so on and on the negotiations would go, and Samuel Sewall, on a number of occasions, would help the process because he wanted to see people happy. And you should be able to marry whomever you choose, slave or no slave. And then he wrote this Talitha Kumi, which comes from the Bible. This is an incident in the Bible where Jesus is raising a woman from the dead. There was a book that he was reading, 2,000 curious questions about various things in nature and science and society. And he was reading this book while his young daughter, not young daughter, but grown daughter, one of his grown daughters, was dying. She had been an invalid most of her life. She was 44 at this time, had been an invalid. He had taken care of her his whole life, and she was now dying. And he picks up this book just to pass the time, and one of the curious questions in this book is, will there be women in heaven? Since we really don't need them in heaven, the purpose of women, as we know, is to bear children. And since that is not needed in heaven, maybe there won't be women in heaven. Of course, the answer may be, according to these guys, just that there will be no sex in heaven, as in there will not be anything distinguishing men from women. That could have been one of the answers. But Sewall takes this very personally and says, here I'm sitting at the bedside of my daughter who's dying, and they have the impertinence to say such a thing about women. So he wrote this out, saying how much God values women, and that it's a terrible thing to say that women will not be needed in heaven. And so instead of saying that women won't be needed in heaven, how about impertinent men aren't needed either?
Amen.
So here's a few things in his diary that I just thought would be interesting. Imagine your young child is sick and throwing up, and these tapeworms start coming out of the stomach, which was a fairly common thing in those days. So your daughter is now throwing up an 11-inch tapeworm, and you're writing it in your diary. At one time, there was a group of pirates who had been caught. And as a matter of fact, Samuel Sewall's son was involved in catching those pirates. And they were brought to justice. And 6 of the 7 that were about to be hung, 6 were hung, 1 was reprieved at the last minute. But anyway, when they were hung, and there's a huge crowd of people watching this, as it's practically a holiday when people are hung. And so when they drop, a great gasp and screams from the crowd that his wife Hannah could hear a mile away. He also observed the sad death of conjoined twin girls, who he describes, they were attached at the side from just under the armpit to the hip. Interesting curiosity. And he talks about his friends. Why in the world would you wear a periwig? Those things are atrocious. They're gaudy. It's unbecoming of a Christian to wear such a thing. And so he has this one conversation that's kind of interesting with this friend of his. who at one day he sees him with his beautiful black hair, and then the next day in church he's wearing this big gaudy periwig. And he says, "What extremity drove you to such an act? Why would you do such a thing?" And the guy basically says, "No extremity at all. I like the fashion. And so I'm going to wear this periwig."
Why are they called periwigs rather than just wigs?
I'm not sure, honestly. I think a wig is just short for periwig. I was going to look that up and I didn't. I could have this for next week if you like, but if you want to find out, it's fine. And as I had mentioned earlier, there's death on almost every page of his diary. He hears of somebody who went for a sleigh ride in winter, and the next thing you know, they find him the next day frozen to death. People drowned constantly because swimming is not a big sport back in those days. Many people did know how to swim, but many did not. Even a sailor, you'd think sailors would learn how to swim, but many did not know how to swim. And so drowning was a very common occurrence. And of course, death by disease, ever present as well. Whenever the smallpox came through, it would wipe out hundreds of people. And of course, you always hear of the Indian attacks up north, usually. And that could be 12 people were killed, could be 100 people were killed. Then of course he would record when the colonists would attack the Indians and kill 100 of them. Death was an ever-present threat. Now here's an interesting little anecdote that he writes about. The governor is out in his, they called it a chariot, but it's a carriage with a couple others, and he comes across two men who are hauling firewood, and it's a fairly narrow road, but there is one side track that one of them could take, and the governor demands that they take the other track. Well, they have a large cart, much larger than his carriage, and they're saying basically, no, you need to go around us, not the other way around. We don't have room, you do. And the governor is in a rage and shouting at them, and they answer quite impertinently, "I'm as good of flesh and blood as you," which really makes him angry, and because after all, he's the governor, and he's above the common sort. "You rogue or rascal, I shall have that way." And it just so happens there was a constable who came by, and he orders the constable to arrest these two rogues, and they were put in prison. Samuel Sewall hears about this, and the first thing he does is work to get them out of jail on bail. The governor did not want them on bail, he wanted them in jail. But Samuel Sewall got them out. The case, such a petty little thing, the case lasted well over a year in court. But Samuel Sewall, as a judge, went and investigated. He went out to the place. He talked to the people. How did this happen? What were the circumstances? And so he looks at the road, and he sees the carts, the carriage that the governor was riding in, and he concludes that the two men were in the right. They could not have gotten out of the way, and the governor could have very easily taken the side road. So eventually the men are acquitted of the charges. And here's the arrogant Governor Joseph Dudley.
Boo.
Boo, yeah, that's right. After 41 years with Hannah, she She eventually dies at the age of 59, 1717, having 14 children, only 5 of which lived to adulthood. And so he has, now he's thinking, I'm now a widow, and what do I do? Should I marry again or not? And within a few months, he began courting. He didn't talk much about this in his diary. It was really just a couple of sentences. Went to see Miss Abigail Tilley and asked her, they have negotiations, right? This is not just, I love you and let's get married. This is a business arrangement. Both of them have money. So the negotiations are, whoever dies first, what will you leave to me as opposed to your children? And that has to be discussed. And his proposition was, if I die first, I will leave you with 100 pounds per year. And so that seemed good to Miss Abigail Tilley. And they were married. On the wedding night, she starts coughing uncontrollably. She never completely recovered from the illness that she had, whatever it was. We suspect that his first wife, Hannah, died from malaria. There's no real reason or no way to tell for sure, but those were the symptoms of malaria. This could have been the same. Anyway, it was a terrible fever and coughing, and within 7 months of their wedding, she was dead. Now we come to, if you are a scholar of Samuel Sewall, you will know that this next incident in his diary and in English anthologies, his courtship of Miss Winthrop, or Mrs. Winthrop, is a classic. He's 68 and now courting again, and he visited Catherine Winthrop. She's 56 and a widow. She had been married to Waite Still Winthrop, the man who he has taken the place of as Supreme Court Justice. On his first visit, he's letting her know his intentions. He says to her, of all the widows in church, and by the way, when you go to church, you can look to one side and you will see the widows area. They all sit together. That is known as the widow's pews. And he says to her, before I see any of the other widows, I wanted to see you first. And I wanted to talk to you about courtship. And she starts talking about, well, Mrs. So-and-so might be a good choice for you too. And there's this other widow that you might be interested in, and this other one too. And so he didn't take the hint that she's trying to point him in another direction. He kept pursuing her. On the second visit, she basically says, you know, I really don't want to leave my house, my children, my neighbors. I'm very well invested in this neighborhood. They both live in Boston, okay? It's not like they're going, it's a long distance relationship. But she says she doesn't want to leave her children, who also live in this house, and her neighbors and her business in this part of the city. But he kept on, and he would visit her 2 or 3 times a week, and he would bring presents, not only to her, but to her children and to her servants. Sometimes it was money. He would give a shilling or two to a young child or to a servant. He would bring presents like glazed almonds, sugared almonds, which were a great treat. And he would give them to her, and he would talk about these things and how much everything cost in his diary. I remember as a college student in my English class going over this and reading this and discussing this in class. And I remember I made the comment, why in the world would he say these things? Why in the world? It seems very embarrassing to have this written down. And so the professor asked me, he said, well, aren't these things that you might have thought about? And I said, yes, but I wouldn't write them down. Because now everybody knows about it. Of course, long after he's dead, but anyway. So yeah, all these things that he's giving as gifts in his diary. This is how much these almonds cost. This is how much this other thing cost. And he would talk about he's sitting down with her and she presents, she gives him some marmalade and wine. They would call it Canary because the wine was from the Canary Islands. Her thing was, I want you to have a coach for yourself. You need to own a coach because that's the style in which I want to live. Also, I want you to wear a periwig because that's the fashionable thing. And of course, he comes back with, coaches are really expensive, okay? To buy a coach and then to keep a servant who drives the coach, that costs an awful lot of money. And the periwigs, please don't get me started on that. That's kind of an arrogant thing to wear. So they weren't getting along. However, he kept pursuing her. And there's one little incident that I thought was very cute. He's sitting down with her, and she wears gloves, as fashionable ladies do. And so what would you imagine the most risque thing that a Puritan could do with a young lady, or not young lady, but with a lady, and that is to take her glove off, because he wanted to kiss her hand. And so he says to her, I hope you wouldn't think it impertinent of me if I could remove your glove. And she says, well, why do you want to remove my glove? And because I would rather handle a lady rather than a dead goat. Because the gloves are made of goat skin. So anyway, that's kind of the banter that would go between them. But he got the glove off. And that was a triumph for him. And at one point in his diary, he mentions that he told her, and here's an old line, right? Your kisses are sweeter than wine. So they did kiss, or maybe he's just referring to him kissing her hand. It's hard to tell. But yes, talk about an old line. Your kisses are sweeter than wine. Ultimately, she said no. No, I do not want to marry you. After 6 weeks of him pursuing her, but he did marry, finally, Mary Gibbs, 1772. I might also add that 4 years later, this was 1720 when he was pursuing Mrs. Winthrop. 4 years later, he was sitting at her deathbed, consoling her because she was dying of some illness or other, and they continued to be good friends apparently through all this time. And so he sat at her deathbed, and a few days later he was her pallbearer in her funeral. The final years, as I had mentioned earlier, he loved to sing. Music was very important to him. In church, he was the guy who was to set the tone of the hymn. There are no instruments, as I mentioned. So how do you set the tone? Well, there's one guy in the choir who is supposed to set the tone for everybody else, and that was Samuel Sewall. And he was very proud of that. He loved doing that. He loved singing. And he did that in church for many, many years. In his 50s, he started realizing that his voice was not the same as it was. And he continued on, and he started telling people, oh, maybe I shouldn't be the one to set the tone anymore. And they kept encouraging him, no, you are the one. You're still good. But finally, he had to give that up. He could not hold a tune as he once had. He lost his teeth at the age of 73, and he mentioned that in his diary very briefly. Lost my upper and lower teeth. I don't know if it was in one day, but it was fairly shortly, almost all at one time. He had to resign his position as Chief Justice of Massachusetts and his position as Suffolk County Probate Court, 1728. His last diary entry, a father had come to him for his son, the father's son, asking for his granddaughter's hand in marriage, or permission to court his granddaughter. His granddaughter was living with him because her mother had died, and so this gentleman came for his son to ask if his son could court the granddaughter. This was the last entry of his diary, October 1729. He did give permission for his daughter to be courted by this young man. He died January 1st, early in the morning, 1730, age 77, along with his friends and family all gathered around. The last month of his life, everybody knew time was short. He was all but completely bedridden and declining fast. And so everybody who knew him well would come and visit him. His sons, and by this time he had 2 sons and 1 daughter left. All the rest had passed. And at the ripe old age of 77, he died in bed. And here's his final resting place. Again, no statues to Samuel Sewall. Any questions? Yes?
Where is that?
It's in Boston somewhere. I know there's a cemetery, a famous cemetery. The name is escaping me at this point. Does anybody know that? It's the hill. There's a hill in Boston. Copp's Hill, is it? I think. A lot of Puritans are buried there. Okay.
What
Yeah.
happened to the granddaughters? There were so many, I mean.
I didn't follow his lineage, but yeah, they're well taken care of. He was a prosperous man, so if they weren't married off already, which they would be, but yeah, they were taken care of one way or another by the men that they married, probably. Anything else? All right, so next week, the great Puritan preacher and evangelist, Jonathan Edwards. We'll see you next week.